Welcome back to Lokad. Today I'll be talking to Lokad founder and CEO Joannes Vermorel about the critical differences between supply chain and logistics. As you'll hear, this is a very important point for companies, particularly as the world trends in the direction of increased automation. Now, as always, if you like what we do at Lokad, consider subscribing to the YouTube channel and following us on LinkedIn. And with that, I politely invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation. So Joannes, welcome to the new studio, the Black Lodge. How do you feel?
It's quite nice. I mean, fun fact for the audience is that it's the first time that we are not actually sitting in the kitchen, just in front of a couple of appliances, such as like 2 fridges, a series of microwave and whatnot.
Dishwasher. Yeah.
So we are for the first time we have our own private space. That's very nice.
That's actually quite fun now. If you think about that in terms of little Easter eggs, if you go back over the 7 years, there have been a few heated exchanges between you and some guests. So the context being that directly behind the camera, there are people making their lunch, people making a coffee, etc., etc. Well, in any case, the studio is not finished yet, but we can't let that get in the way of important business, which brings me to today's topic. Supply chain does not equal logistics. So Joannes, 30,000 foot view, why are we here?
So the terminology is quite complicated in the field. The thing is that what people have been calling logistics until probably, let's say, the 1970s is what people are now calling supply chain. So there have been, some gradual evolution of the meaning of the terms. We had, logistics emerge as a military term in the 19th century, and it was a French word that says the specialty of the logis. So that was a military terms, and at the time the problem was to find shelter for your troops.
Is that Mognet?
Sorry?
Mognet, the mathematician?
No, it was theorized by I forgot the names, 2 generals, one French, one from Switzerland. And they theorized the idea of organizing troop movements and taking care of shelter, food, supply, and whatnot. And that was pretty much the sort of start of large-scale organization, synchronization of large organization. And that's fast forward a century and a half later, that was pretty much the logistics. And then we had the operation research as a field, which became very important in the aftermath of the Second World War. And out of that emerged, I would say, supply chain and logistics who took different paths. So it really, when you say what does those terms mean, it really depends on which decades do you consider. Nowadays, if I have to really summarize, supply chain is the art of decision making. So it's really about making decisions. And logistics is really about execution of those decisions. So there is really a split, and supply chain deals with white collar people and do decision making process. Logistics deals with largely blue collar people and make stuff happen once the decision have been made.
Historically, at least up until very recently, supply chain and logistics were treated as more or less synonyms. So what led to that divergence, as you said, with supply chain focusing more on white collar and logistics blue collar?
It was primarily the emergence of software. Until I would say the late 70s, the only entity capable of taking any kind of decision was a person. So that would be the supervisor who was supervising the people doing the stuff, who would also call the shot and take the decision. So until the 70s, you see, the idea that you would segregate the two didn't really make sense. But as soon as you started to introduce, layers of software, then the separation becomes more and more obvious. I mean, first, the complexity grew enormously. So since the late 70s, supply chains have probably multiplied the amount of product references and variants and everything by a factor, I would estimate probably of 100. So the situation is vastly more complex than it was 50 years ago. Again, that is really software making that possible. We have now warehouses that can contain, let's say, up to 100,000 distinct articles. This is, again, this is a much bigger complexity than what used to be. And as a result, dealing with the complexity and dealing with the decision-making processes became a skill of its own that is very analytical, very, I would say, data-oriented, and where people are using instruments. Even if the instrument is as crude as, let's say, an Excel spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet lets you deal with thousands of products, and it requires some specialized skills as well. So that's why there was like a divergence between the sort of analytical skills, what we are calling supply chain today, which involves forecasting, setting inventory parameters and whatnot, and I would say pure execution, I would say skills that are around the physical execution, which is, for example, manage the truck drivers, make sure they are on time, make sure that nobody is drunk, make sure that everybody is driving safely, etc., etc. So the two things really took different paths, I would say, onward.
True. That said, if you operate purely in the logistics space, I mean, you still use software. There are still decisions that have to be made. So could you drill down a bit on that distinction
so
then?
If you look at, for example, logistics and you look at the route that the trucks would follow, even if some companies still think of that as a function of logistics, I think of that as a function of supply chain.
Okay.
See, the logistic director, the person who is supervising the truck drivers, who is making sure that the trucks themselves are in good shape, that they are safe, etc., etc. They are, I would say, they get a piece of software that will give them the route that they need to follow. And this is it. So you see, this is not from the logistic director that you would expect a certain refinement from the route optimization algorithm. You see, this is, so the fact that, as I said, logistics, they execute the decisions that have been generated for them. And thus, the generation of those decisions belong to the realm of supply chain. Then the execution is the realm of logistics. So yes, there are decisions, but I would say the logistic director doesn't call the shot in the algorithmic optimization that goes on into establishing the circuit. And if this route is defective, they would probably request some other party to deal with that. They will not be dealing with that themselves.
Well, that reminds me of a discussion we had not so long ago with, I think, Meinolf Selman, where we talked about the traveling salesman problem. So to take that very concretely, if you're talking about optimizing routes, so I'll let you explain better than me the traveling salesman problem. Delineate, if you can, the supply chain decisions there and where it ends and logistics picks up the slack in terms of decisions.
So again, logistics doesn't pick up the decisions. There is no decisions to be made on the logistics side. Decisions are already made. It's pure about execution. So if you're looking, and that's a modern way, again, 50 years ago, people would not have analyzed a problem like that. But I would say the modern take is that from the logistic perspective, you already have a piece of software given to you by some third party that gives you the routes. It's a given. And also what you should put into the trucks is also a given. And this is up to this third party to make sure that when they suggest to put something in the truck, it fits. It is also up to those third parties, it can be multiple ones, that if you give you a route, the route is correct, and that the time frame, suggested time frame, is also feasible, etc., etc. You see, the perspective would be supply chains deal with all the decisions, all of them, from the super, I would say, short-term decisions like which route should I take next, to the longer-term decisions, what are my capacity projections for the next 5 years. It is just a matter of time horizon, but all of that, from the super short term to the very long term, have in common of being pure analytical processes. So it's stuff that can happen in a piece of software, irrespective of the actual execution. Naturally, the modelization and the calculations needs to be, I would say, adequate with regard to the real world constraints and et cetera, et cetera. So there can be tons of complication. But nevertheless, it is really the decision plane. And logistics is really the execution plane, which is, I give you a route, now there must be a driver that is fit for driving, that happens to sit in the truck, and that will commence the route. And the same thing, by the way, it's logistics is not just drivers, that can be also intra-logistics, inside a facility, et cetera, et cetera. And when you look at this separation, actually the more meaningful distinction nowadays would most likely be supply chain versus operations. Operations being the person who supervises all the blue-collar jobs of the company, logistics being a class of those jobs, but you would also have other types, such as just productions, for example, people who have they are blue collars, but they have like a static positioning, and they operate a piece of machinery or something, as opposed to be moving stuff around.
So I don't want to jump too far ahead, but you did provide me a nice transition there for a point that I do want to hammer down on, which is, you talked about basically the physical constraints there. So you have a route, and logistics, make sure that driver is there, or pick the driver that will execute that step. That sounds very similar to the sort of thing that companies like Lokad, for example, does when it comes to scheduling, where you take, you take parts, tools, and people, just for example. Take this part, put it over there with this tool over there, and take Joannes, because Joannes has this level of accreditation, this level of skills, and he's available that day, and he goes over there, and he stands there for X amount of minutes to complete step 11 of 20 or whatever. All of that is supply chain decision making. That's what we provide.
Yes.
So where does that, again, that's handling the physical dimension. So again, where I'm unsure where logistics fits into that, because it sounds like supply chain's done it all.
No, you see, you have really, again, if we go back to the pre-software world, the only person who is in a position to make those decisions is the supervisor who is on site, close to whoever is going to execute the decision. So in this situation, you cannot split the responsibility. The person who is supervising the truck drivers is also calling the shots with regard to what they're doing. You see, it is only because we have software that is also networked. So you see everything, you have your supply chain is distributed in many places, and you can have layers of software that just connect all of that. So making the geography kind of irrelevant. Again, speed of light is sufficiently fast so that it is, I would say, the information can flow at a speed that is vastly faster than anything that is happening physically. So once you have, network software in place, then you can really, I would say, decouple monitoring the execution of the task and making the decisions. And what I say is that supply chain is about making the decisions. And that includes all the sort of anything that is kind of planning related, in fact, belong to supply chain. So deciding at what time your truck drivers should arrive, how many do you need, how many trucks do you need, what do you need to put in those trucks, do you need some special equipment so that you can even load them, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is supply chain. What is not supply chain, however, is, let's say, just make sure that people don't kill themselves with forklift, that the equipment is used appropriately, that people are not, sick on the job, that the morale is good, that, et cetera, et cetera. All those sort of things that are really, I would say, process-oriented. It's not really a decision being made. It is more about being compliant with your own processes and your own, I would say, ways of doing things, and that's it. You see, so it's not I would not say that it belongs to a decision. For example, let's say a forklift has a speed limit in a warehouse. This is indeed kind of a decision, but not really, because it's not really up to change. This thing is going to be established once, it won't change, and for the entire duration of the operation of the warehouse, there will be a speed limit for the forklift, and that's it. So you see, I do not, and that will be on the part of logistics, but I do not see that as a decision that needs to be made. It was made once as a matter of engineering. What is exactly safe? The safe limit to operate with this forklift in this facility, and that's it. So it's completely, I would say, established. It becomes like a rigid process, and this is it. Same thing, for example, for let's say consumption of alcohol and driving. The policy would be you just don't, and that's it. And it's not a decision that is up to revision on any given day. Like there are days where you can drink and some you don't. No. It's like you don't drink alcohol prior to operating the truck. This is it. So you see, that's where I would say logistics is dealing with things that are processes that need to be executed correctly, but in a way it's completely immutable. What they're looking for, it's very steady. What is changing all the time is like the planning and the list of stuff that they need to do, which is, I would say, composed pretty much on the fly, possibly by software entities or whatever. And those things, they belong to supply chain, because they are just purely analytical and they are up to change. That's also what makes them interesting as decisions. Supply chain decision is that they change on a daily basis. If it never changes, it's probably not a supply chain decision.
Okay. So again, just to collapse all that, supply chain, which we've covered before, subject to great degrees of uncertainty. Is your position that logistics is not?
Yes, in the sense that, again, people would say, oh, but there is so much uncertainty, look, so much, things vary so much. Yes, the conditions vary, and the planning that is given to you vary. However, the way you're supposed to execute do not vary. In the sense that, for example, how to drive a truck safely do not depend on the type of deliveries that you have to make. You have like max speed limit. You're not supposed to brake too strong, or I would say too fast, otherwise the truck that is driving behind you may have a problem, etc., etc. So your operating, I would say, processes are completely invariant. That the sort of safety policies that are in place are going to be the same all the time, and they do not depend on the planning of the day. What makes, I would say, a good truck driver do not depend on the content of the truck. Maybe, again, I would say, unless you have cargoes that really require specialized skills and whatnot, but I'm digressing. But you see, the point is, I would say, the challenge in logistics is to maintain, I would say, complete adherence to your policies at all time. That's the main challenge, and this is very difficult. The challenge with supply chain is to come up with, I would say, good decisions that are adequate despite the fact that everything is kind of constantly changing. So you see, this is very, very different perspectives.
So this makes sense as you describe it to me, but what I'm curious is, how radically does your position here differ from what would be the mainstream conception now of supply chain and logistics decision-making processes?
I think companies have gradually, have been over the last 2 decades, gradually converging to this sort of understanding. The process was very much, I would say, empirical. And what companies realize is that as supply chain gets, gets more and more prominent. Again, you have supply chain has the supply chains, not the discipline. Supply chains have been digitalized decades ago, and thus they came with an increasing number of software tools. Even, for example, spreadsheets, you have to extract data from many systems. So even if we are talking of, let's say, a crude analytics done with spreadsheets, you still have tons of instruments. So the reality was that if you have, let's say, a logistic director who is spending a lot of time on the ground, in the warehouses, this person is not really necessarily developing the skills it takes to crunch all this data and developing all the analytical skills. So I think companies more or less, I would say, empirically just realized that they needed to have people that were more on the analytical side. And conversely, they realized that people that were doing analytics, they had very few people to manage, and especially very few blue collar to manage. And that's a completely different skills as opposed to manage white collars in a nice, clean office that is completely safe. It's a very, very different proposition. And so companies have been gradually converging toward blue collar management, logistic director, white collar management, supply chain director. And now where there is still some residual, I would say, confusion is that some companies have not yet completely come to terms of just remove all the analytical pieces from the logistic director so that this person do not have to deal with, I would say, fancy analytics anymore at all. And then I would say put under the umbrella of supply chain all the analytical decisions, all of them from the very short term to the very long term. Again, that is typically the supply chain position starts with, let's say, the more long-term objectives. But the reality is that those decision-making processes, what belongs to supply chain is from the very short term to the very long term. And when I say very short term, can be even down to what decisions need to be made in the next milliseconds if you're actually driving robots inside an automated warehouse. So obviously there is a lot of, let's say, algorithms involved. If you're looking at long-term forecast, it's much less an algorithmic process. But still, it is very much the decision-making plane. And it's just, from super short-term to super long-term.
Again, you touched on some points there of like digitization, and software skills required. What would be the difference as you see it, the difference between, I think you said, the supply chain director and the logistics director in terms of computer savviness? What would the differences there be?
I mean, my view would be that a logistic director can know almost nothing about, I would say, about computer systems. They just need to be, again, they are supposed to have their teams of blue collars have systems that tell them what they should be doing. So it should be savvy enough so that he or she can read the planning.
They're literate.
Yes, but that's it. At no point this person will be expected to program anything or to advance anything that would be more than just basic percentages to monitor the performance of the teams and other simple indicators, you see. So the way I see logistics, it will be really a people job. You supervise people, you make sure they're safe, you make sure they are in good condition physically because they do a job that is physical, as opposed to the supply chain director where I would say it is a very, very analytical position. So it's a person that is going to spend most of his or her days crunching numbers. And thus, I think even if it is still possible for those positions to be held by people who are not, savvy in terms of programming, I would say a decade onward, I would say that programming will be like a base requirement. Because at some point, if you want to be able to crunch number, and do non-trivial stuff, you need to enter the realm of programming.
Are there any examples of companies that have, let's say, failed to implement the kind of distinction that you're talking about now? Or if I rephrase it, companies that have not had that divergence of supply chain and logistics, and they essentially treat the two as continuing to be synonymous, or even just one department, for example?
It's still frequent when we discuss with prospects to end up with companies that have, what typically happens is that some I would say old school companies still are using the term logistics, but in fact, the logistic director is a de facto supply chain director. So you see the role of this person has already evolved, but then the problem is that you end up with a person that has that has for the job position requirements that are extremely divergent, because you see it's on one hand you need to deal with teams of blue collars, and on the other hand you need to refine the forecast. So it is too demanding for them. So you can have, on the other hand, also the situations where you have logistic director that just change their title on LinkedIn to upgrade towards supply chain director. But same thing, they end up with skills that are all over the place. And then you have also a lot of companies that have now a logistic director and a supply chain director, but that have not completely rearranged the responsibility. And so they still have some of the short-term decisions, such as route optimization, that is still on the logistic side, although it represents a mismatch with regard to the skill of the, I would say, of the leadership of logistics. This should be moved toward much more, I would say, software-savvy sort of teams, and that should be supply chain. Again, it is a matter of the way I am thinking of what is the correct way to organize a company is that what are the sort of aggregate of skills that make sense. And my take is that the decision plane really needs people to be extremely savvy software-wise, and anything that touch blue collar, it's really people-wise, and the sort of take and mental perspective are very, very different.
When you, again, to amplify just a little key point here, when we talk about supply chain optimization, a lot of that rests on, at least for Lokad, rests on the idea of automation. And if you embrace that concept, there is theoretically, I'm sure there is an upper limit to how much you can optimize supply chain decision making. But if it's automated, let's say it's very, very high, because you have automated away processes that otherwise would have been manually handled. Now, per contra, if you have logistics, which, as you've said for about 20 minutes now, is almost exclusively a physical enterprise involving kinetic movement of people and wrangling people together, not to be reductive, but you're marshalling the troops. To what degree can you optimize logistics compared to the degree that you can optimize supply chain, financially speaking?
Yes. So the mechanization of blue collars has been an ongoing process for like 2 centuries, maybe 3. It is progressing at a pace that is still steady, but generally speaking, that is much, much slower to what is happening on the software space.
Interesting.
Again, most of the progress is nowadays, I would say there has been during the last decade, warehouses are getting increasingly robotized. But it's a slow process. It started with warehouses that were dealing with limited diversity of products, products that were relatively small because it was easy to automate. So there was, we started with the easy situation, and also the situation that were very painful, like let's say frozen food, because nobody wants really to work all day long at minus 20 degrees Celsius. So it was pretty much the situation that were either easy to automate, or the situations where it was really painful for the people to operate that were getting automated first. But this is a process that will probably take, from the start, which I would say probably start was in the early 2000s, till the end, it would be probably 20 years from now. So it will have taken something like 4 decades to automate the warehouses. Now we will have another piece that will have to be automated, and this had not even started, which is automate truck drivers. That will happen at some point. It will probably start, my guesstimation, it will start before the end of this decade. But
at scale, probably
but
not.
At scale, yes, it will also probably take 2 or 3 decades, to complete, because you have all sorts of problems. You can remove the driver, but you still need someone to load and unload the trucks. Yeah. That's a problem that can probably be solved, because at some point there will be systems automated to load and unload the trucks, etc. So you see, and the same thing has been happening in factories. the stuff that was easy to automate has been automated decades ago. So what remains as manual tasks are the stuff that is quite difficult to automate. So you see, this is a situation. So I think on the logistics side, the goal is still to automate everything. And the process will still continue probably for most of the 21st century. So it's still ongoing. And, but the pace, I would say, is very much set. And people are not really, they expect it, but it will keep progressing, a few % per year for the foreseeable future. So I would say this is a given, and people expect that. There is no grand surprise. And again, it has been steady for a very long time. Nobody is surprised anymore when some stuff gets automated. Everything gets gradually automated. And sometimes there is something that, got, let's say, a warehouse gets replaced by a new one, and then you need 10 times less operator. But on a grand scale, the process is slow and steady. On the software space,
which affects more of the supply chain decisions.
Yes, I think the situation is very different, because unlike I would say the physical space, you don't need. It is much more a matter of technology rather instead of being a matter of upfront capital investment. You see, one of the reasons why not all warehouses are not being robotized immediately, it's because the activity is extremely capital intensive. I mean, we're talking for a large warehouse to make it completely automated, hundreds of millions of euros.
Yeah, you mentioned an example before to me off camera about Air France. The one roof something.
Yes, exactly. I mean, for example, they have Air France Industries has a one roof initiative where they want to connect essentially 2 large buildings to make sure that all their MRO activities can be carried pretty much in a large unit, and having just one roof simplify everything, because that means that at no point parts
are
just outside, exposed to
getting
the
wet,
elements.
getting cold, getting stuck, falling off, whatever.
Yes, plus there is tons of process. As soon as a part leaves your facility, then it needs to be readmitted with very strict criteria. So it just complicates everything. So it's easier. But yes, if you want to invest and connecting 2 buildings that are already very large, and you want to add something like, 200 meters worth of roof, we are talking of tens of millions of euros of investment just to make that happen. So things takes a lot of time. And companies, even if they would be, they would be inclined in doing it all, their resources force them to pace themselves. And that's the same thing, by the way. Most of our clients in aerospace nowadays are gradually investing in automated warehouses. But it takes time just because it's very expensive. And unlike, let's say, the Amazons of this world, the return on investment is not as spectacular as it is, let's say, for an e-commerce like Amazon. So that takes time. In software, the thing is that it's more like until the technology is not there yet, people really struggle to automate at all. And then once it is there, the deployment can happen much faster, because there is not that much investment to be made. I mean, yes, there are investments to be made, but they are kind of inconsequential compared to what needs to be done on the physical front. Yes.
Well, this is going back a while. It was last year. I can't remember what article we were talking about, but we were talking about the difference between automation, again, in software, and how quick and rapid that can be once the technology exists. If it's software-based, it can proliferate quite quickly, compared to even just getting a robotic hand that can actually replicate the dexterity of a human hand. That's still quite difficult, if not yet discovered. And people then have a bit of a misconception about, well, AI, automation, it's everywhere. It's like, well, in certain sectors, yes, and in very specific areas, yes. For example, the software that generates decision making, yes. The ability to nimbly load, unload, tie knots, things like that, not yet, and probably not for quite a while, from what you're saying.
Yes, I mean, if you want to just have manipulating arms, the thing is that we already have tons of technologies, but they all have, the limitations of their own. You have systems that are extremely fast and precise, but they are not adaptive. So that means that the parts needs to have the exact correct initial position. That's what you have in the automotive industries. You have robotic arms that are extremely fast, extremely precise, but they are not intelligent. So, so parts, the input of your robot needs to be perfectly placed. Then you have some stuff that are capable of dealing with a lot of uncertainty, but they are slow, and they are not very strong, etc., etc. So you end up, and all of that is progressing, gradually. But still, you end up with situations where, when you do the math, people are cheaper. So every year, the sort of spectrum of operations where machines are cheaper just extend, and that's exactly what I was describing with, blue collar being gradually mechanized. The process is still ongoing. For example, France is still losing about 1% of their farmer every year, and the production of food of France is still kind of growing of something like 1% every year as well. So we have every year we have 1% less people. We produce 1% more. And by the way, as a third, I think we also do it with 1% less land. So that's this sort of progress. And when you look through the course of a century, that's an enormous progress. But it is, I would say, slow and steady, and nobody really expects any kind of major breakthrough. Software is very different, and yes, innovation can I would say, proliferate much faster because the amount of investment is much lower.
And speaking of investment, in terms of gauging the return on investment, if you invest in your supply chain decision-making software, you can use certain financial metrics to determine whether or not that is having a positive impact. If logistics is a purely, or at least predominantly, if not purely, physical enterprise, how do you gauge the impact? Is it, you use the same metrics? You use financial return on investment?
For logistics and for
supply chain, comparing the two.
So logistics, you see,
how do you know it's getting better? Excuse me, let me rephrase. How do you know it's getting better?
Yeah, how do you know it's getting better? So logistics, the idea is that you have a mission that is given to you, and it is not acceptable to accomplish the missions in ways that would, let's say, endanger people. It's a no-go. So you have the mission that needs to be accomplished with full compliance to, whatever would pass as sanity. And now it is just a matter of cost. Just, can you do it cheaper? That's it. So you see, if you want to, somebody order a product online, the question will be, how much does it cost you to ship this product from your warehouse and make it arrive, and have the product arrive on the doorstep of the client within this time frame? And so the progress in logistics is really about cutting costs through automation. That's it. That's it. Through supply chain, this is much, the question is much more open. Because again, supply chain is not, it is a very, very, I would say, open-ended challenge. There is no upper limit on how much you can improve your decisions.
That's what I said earlier.
So it's a completely different game, in the sense that, for example, you see, it could be, how many variants should you introduce? That would be a supply chain question. You have a product, you can have more variants to please more people, but is there any limit on the number of variants? Well, every variant that you introduce creates some extra overhead, and there is diminishing returns. So there is a balance, but you see the amount of questions that can be asked, like the prices, whether you should steer them up or down, etc., etc. So it's I'm not saying that there is no absolute limit in what you could expect from better supply chain decision, but still it is something where there is no clear limit in how far you can go. And the questions are much more open-ended. It's fundamentally you can start considering things that you were not considering. More suppliers, more alternatives, more options, more price schemes and whatnot. There is no clear limit in the realm of logistics. The missions that are given to you are much more narrow and closed. You're not, if the goal is to move a piece from point A to point B, this is it. You can do it cheaper, but ultimately, as part, I would say, of the game of logistics, changing completely the strategy is not of the company itself, of rethinking, for example, the way you're going to deliver stuff to your clients is not part of, I would say, the game of logistics. An example of that would be, let's imagine you have a retail store in fashion. So you have a fashion store. You could, for example, consider that would be a matter of supply chain. Say, if someone, instead of buying the last unit of the store, you give them a discount and they will receive the article sent to them via classic e-commerce. So imagine you have a person that visits the store, but when this person, when the patron is about to take the last unit that is left in the store for a given article, given size, then instead of having this person going on their way with the article, instead they get a discount to just have this unit being sent to them. Why would you do that? Well,
So
you could.
it doesn't look like a stock out?
Yes, exactly. So that would be a way to mitigate the stockouts, and also potentially just increase the assortment. Because then you could afford to keep much fewer units
Yeah,
for
true.
et cetera, et cetera. You see, that would be the sort of things where, okay, supply chain could explore that, but from the perspective of logistics, this is not the game that is being played. The decisions have already been made. It is about to execute what is given to you.
I like that theoretical example you gave, and it actually reminded. I want to just jot it down while you were talking. And I think it was you who mentioned it in one of your lectures, or maybe I heard it from a supply chain scientist. But it was an example from an aerospace client of how they received their daily recommendations of buy this, buy that, and I'm going to simplify it. It was buy these 2 engines. It wasn't as enormous as that, but just buy these 2 parts, and it was flagged as being an incorrect decision. Like, why would we do that? We don't need them. And the algorithm had generated that decision because the price to buy those, let's say, engines new had dropped below a certain point, making it economically rewarding to hold on to them to resell at a later point. So the decision was not of need.
Yes.
It was one of financial opportunity.
Yes, and that happens very typically when you have aircraft that get dismantled.
Yep.
So you can
They
have
suddenly come on the market.
You can have a few extra parts or tons of extra parts that flood the market, and temporarily mistakes are being made sometimes
exactly.
by your peers. And something that should have been sold at the price of, let's say, 100 is sold at the price of 30, and that's an accident. And so you just grab the opportunity because immediately you're making a profit. So yes, that's the sort of, I would say, again,
It's open-ended. It's an example
exactly.
of the open-ended.
Supply chain fundamentally is a very open-ended sort of job, and that's also why, for example, some ideas when we go back to what is the difference between a director of logistics and director of supply chain. You see, when you're playing super open-ended game, there are some qualifier when you're thinking about employees that don't really apply. Let's say, for example, excellency. You see, if we are in the world of logistics, excellency is kind of clear. You have, I would say, you want to be compliant fully to your process. If you do that, I would say you won the game. You're excellent. There is no, that's it. But if you are in the supply chain world, it's, I would say, excellency is very ill-defined. It is because it's so open-ended that how do you know that you're even close to the best you could do? So that's why, for example, people who, I would say, teams that focus on, let's say, excellency, that makes sense if you're very operational with blue collar, because indeed, in their case, if they do everything by the book, exactly as it is done, day after day, congratulations, you're being perfect. We cannot expect anything more from you. But on the supply chain side, this is a very, very different game. It doesn't even make sense to congratulate people as if they had achieved perfection. Yes, you can congratulate people, no problem. But fundamentally, you see, because you have this game that is completely open-ended, fundamentally, every success is just another milestone for the next one that will be even better. That's why it's a very, very different perspective. And it doesn't really make sense in the supply chain world to, let's say, have like an employee of the month, for example. That would be sort of things that employee of the month only makes sense if you have, clear targets where it is possible to be Mr. Perfect and I've done everything perfectly exactly as I was being asked to. In supply chain, no, doesn't make sense.
On that note, the way you describe that, again, if I were to summarize that, in logistics there is a theoretical perfect game. You can play the perfect game, no errors, no mistakes, nobody dies, as you might say. But it occurs to me then that is there not an inherent sort of tension between pursuit of excellence in logistics and pursuit of excellence in supply chain? For example, I give you a schedule, like for production. Here's a production schedule. You need this, you need that. That person at that time, go there. And then logistics says, well, actually, that machine, downtime, I need to repair that because I want to maintain my perfect game in terms of safety. If I let you proceed with your production, which is a supply chain mechanism, it might negatively affect my logistics record of safety and witnessing and maintaining protocols. So is there not a conflict there where pursuit of one kind of comes at the expense of pursuit of the other, or can?
No, not really. I mean, the supply chain needs to have decisions that factors all the constraints of the real world. Okay. That is an immense challenge because there are, for example, the state of repair or disrepair of the machines need to be taken into account, and that information might be missing from the systems and whatnot. So, but fundamentally, this is a job of supply chain to accommodate that. And if they don't know if a machine, the state of repairs of a machine, that they need to have the decisions with some sort of buffers to take into account the fact that there will be unplanned overhead and generate a planning that can still be feasible by logistics or other teams of blue collars once they discover gradually all those overhead. But you see that there is here we are talking of, yes, the plan must be feasible, and that takes into account planning for uncertainty. Again, that's very much supply chain. Now, from the logistic perspective, they would say in their case, the calculation is very different. That would be, we have a machine, let's say, that breaks down 1 day per year. What will be the cost to have a machine that breaks down, 1 day per decade? Maybe it's not worth it. Or you see, or having like a second machine that would just so we have like a spare. But you see, so there might be some calculation involved, but we see that in terms of order of magnitude of decisions, it's much, much lower. And if you start having things that gets really fancy in terms of budget allocation and whatnot, I would say, okay, it goes back to supply chain. We are talking again of a complex decision-making process that needs to be tackled from a very analytical perspective. Again, we are back to supply chain. The compliance from the logistic part would be, do we operate the machine in a way that don't generate premature breakdown? And that's, if they do, they are compliant, they have done their job excellently, and this is it.
It's pure coincidence because I read this not in relation to this interview, but to something else I was writing. So I'm recently a bit familiar with the actual cost of downtimes in certain sectors. Again, so it was a report by Siemens. I think it's actually called The True Cost of Downtime, and it's from last year. And it estimated depending on vertical. So on one end you had fashion or FMCG, and it would be the cost was about $39,000 per hour. And on the extreme end of that spectrum, it was north of $2 million per hour in automotive. If there are unplanned downtimes, and obviously because everything's interdependent, so like this goes down, well that affects the production over there, so there's a knock-on effect. It's not isolated. You have direct and indirect costs. So when you talk about supply chain can factor in the cost of a machine that might or might not be down, how do you exactly reconcile, or how do you factor in the potential enormous financial loss of an unplanned downtime into an optimized schedule when you're getting close to it's possibly due for repair now, or maybe?
I mean, the technical term is stochastic optimization. So you see here we are optimized, but again, you see, stochastic optimization is just optimization under uncertain condition. And that's why it gets super technical. And that's, again, why I think we need to segregate an analytical position, director of supply chain, versus a non-analytical position, such as director of logistics. You see, it is already very difficult to do the sort of data crunching that can be demanded from the director of supply chain. The idea that someone on the logistical side who has to deal with blue collar workers and these sort of things has, on top of that, to deal with, let's say, a very elaborate optimization techniques such as stochastic optimization to take into account uncertainty. Oof. You see, this is just, I don't think it is a very reasonable proposition. And it means also we need to have like a very broad view of what a decision means from a supply chain perspective. A decision, all the decisions that needs to be generated might be alternative plannings for every single situation of every breakdown. You see, it's not just I give you a schedule and you're done. That can be, I have a system that has been engineered by the supply chain team, and if at any point of time I am missing anything, a machine is breaking down, an operator is sick, a part is missing, there is a defect in terms of quality on that, then it gives me an alternative path to follow.
This is the scheduling optimization you're talking about.
Scheduling optimization, or sometimes, even for stock. Let's imagine sometimes you have, and that's something that Lokad already does, such as I'm a warehouse, I must serve a series of stores, but there is just not enough in the warehouse to adequately serve all the stores. So what is left in stock in the warehouse is just, the quantity is too low. So I know I will be causing in the future stockouts in many of those stores just because I don't have enough in the warehouse. Nevertheless, I need to split the inventory somehow. Should I send the bulk of the inventory to one store, or should I just evenly spread the inventory, or something else? So you see, you need to be able to accommodate situations that are slightly defective. And that is part of the decision-making process. This is not about only deciding, I would say, in ideal situation, here's what you should do. No. It's conceptually, you have the entire decision tree of all the alternative paths that may have to be taken if things are not as you planned.
This is actually something that I may talk about at a later date with Simon Shallett, the CTO of the company, because I talked with him recently about this, and he explained about what you were talking about there. Just put some terms on them. The bill of resources. So again, you have the parts, you have the people, you have the tools, and for any given process on any given day, I, Lokad, give you, Joannes, the client, a list of a sequence of actions. You need this and this and this at this time to complete this entire process, and that's generated, let's say, overnight. And then the following morning, oh no, Joannes with his key certifications, qualifications, and training is sick. It just happens. Well, let's say there's a 1% chance that happens. Okay, the entire generated sequence needs to be regenerated to reflect the fact that when that sequence was generated, it reflected a certain state of events, a certain state of reality, which is no longer the case. And maybe you can fill in a little bit more details there, because I'm a neophyte on this.
Again, if we go back to the pre-software world, you can see that exactly the reason why the supervisor of blue collars was also the decision maker, because stuff would come up all the time and they would need someone that can make the decision when you deviate from the plan. But if you have software, then the software layer can make those decisions dynamically on the fly for you. And that's exactly what, for example, route optimization is doing. Let's say you're using Waze. The network Waze is just informed that a street is blocked. In real time, it's going to suggest an alternative road. So you see, there is the decision being made is what is exactly your the itinerary that you are taking, and this thing is revised continuously to take into account the latest state of information that you have about the traffic, about the streets, etc., etc. So you see, when I say supply chain deals with the decision-making process, I'm not necessarily talking of things that are static. It's most likely going to be a piece of software that can automatically revise the decisions according to the latest situation. And that's why, by the way, I also emphasize that automation is the key. Because if you do not have something that is completely automated, then that means that in terms of reactivity, if you have to go through a person, it's going to be slow.
Like multiple people, most likely.
Yeah, I mean, we are talking of, if you have to consult with someone, we are talking of what, half an hour response time?
If they're available.
If they are available, etc. So it is very, very, very slow. So the only way to realistically have the decisions managed by the supply chain is to automate them completely. Otherwise, you end up back to what was done before, which is the supervisor, logistics
yeah.
on the site, just improvise. And again, it is not necessarily, I would say, it is better than do nothing, but it can lead to all sorts of relatively bad decisions. Where, and especially situations of non-compliance, such as, for example, where a driver would end up driving more
hours than
they are allowed, and then accident may happen. And it's very difficult to, top of your head, readjust the planning in real time, quasi, so that you preserve all the environments you want to preserve. That's really what software is good for.
Alexei, who you know, Alexei Tikhonov, I've spoken with him before in Dijon. He has a nice phrase for what you're just describing there, which is open square bracket, any alternative solution is often a low bandwidth solution to a high dimensional problem, which is, as you just said there, there's the immediate consequences, there's the near stream consequences, there's the far downstream consequences, the contingencies, like if I send you there, I can't send you there, the opportunity cost, this implies that, maybe or maybe that. And humans genuinely, I think it's unreasonable to expect any human or even a group of humans in real time with potentially $39,000 to $2 million per hour on the line and penalties, contractual penalties and compliance issues to collaborate and just go, that's the best solution to this problem. That's unreasonable in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, in practice, people just have heuristics.
FIFO, for example.
Yeah, FIFO, exactly. First in, first out. So again, it's okay. And I would even say that crafting the superior version of those heuristics is also a supply chain problem. You see, so it would also be normally the mission of supply chain to hand over the heuristics so that if all the software system fails, here are like your super simple heuristics that you need to adopt to kind of make the stuff, to keep the flow going. But we shouldn't be under no illusion that those super crude heuristics are not going to be very, very good. They are going to be better than freezing everything, but they are not going to be very good. They are not going to be very efficient, and they will lead to predictable problems.
Yeah. Well, again, it's often things like, to take the example of FIFO, and again, correct me where I'm wrong, but just to sketch that out, why, because anyone listening to that, what's wrong with FIFO? As a side conversation, correct me where I'm wrong, but if you had, let's take MRO, you have two engines, engine A, engine B. Engine A comes in before engine B, requires more or less the same parts, same expected repair time. Engine A comes in first, so first in, first out. I work on that first, but to complete the repairs, I need another part that is not yet available. Whereas if engine B, if I were to repair that first, it came in second, but if I repair that first, it can get back into rotation or back into operation much quicker. There might be financial implications to not getting engine B out the door as quickly as possible. Again, now that's a very black and white scenario, but it illustrates I have a heuristic. It's better than nothing. Repairing one is better than not repairing any, granted. But is that a financially optimized decision to take? Arguably not if you're trying to maximize profit, return on investment.
Yes, and again, that's why you need to separate those functions, logistics, supply chain. If you're already dealing with blue collars, it is an immense responsibility. Being able to do like real-time financial optimization in your head is just kind of nonsense. It is not feasible. the best you can expect from people who are like not superhumans are just basic heuristics that they can follow. The rest, anything more elaborate than that, needs to be done with people who can devote all their intellect to analytical processes. There is no workaround. And the thing that has really changed is that software make it possible. I mean, it made it possible decades ago by just making the information available at people that are at a distance. So suddenly you don't need to be in the middle of the warehouse to know how much stock is left and what are the pending orders of the client of the day. So you can be at a distance on the desk and still have access to all the relevant information. So that's what I would say software enabled in the late 90s, pretty much for all companies. That's how people started to isolate those functions, because then people could work on their spreadsheets, even if the software was not providing any intelligence. So we are still talking of a pre-automation sort of era where we have just segregated people and we can have the white collar in a different place. But nowadays, what we can have is the superior version where we can just automate the whole thing. And so the white collar people are not doing the decision-making process anymore. They are engineering the numerical recipe to have those executed automatically.
And again, even from a risk management perspective, you would say that this is a superior approach?
I mean, the thing is that if you depend on people, then mistakes will be made, again and again. That's so you can, in a way, if you want decisions to be very, very safe, then you can do that just like engineering is done in aviation, which is you have a lot of sequential reviews of the work. And once you have like 5 stages of incremental reviews and whatnot, you can be very, very confident in your outcome. But the problem is that it's like super slow. And that's why, for example, when you want to put a new aircraft on the market, it takes a decade, because you have this super slow process of everything is going to be reviewed again and again and again. The problem with supply chain is that you need the decisions to be made quickly. So having like a many stage process for reviewing the decision tends to, I would say, to create more overhead than the problem it's attempting to solve, which is the occasional incorrect decision. So you need to make it fast. And if you have automation, the thing is that if you have a numerical recipe that has a defect, you fix a defect. And then all the decisions that you will generate from now on are free of this defect. And that makes the process much more capitalistic. That's why Lokad, we really favor this automate everything approach. It is not really for just the productivity part. It is really about the fact that you can have like an accretive process where every hour that you invest makes the numerical recipe better, and every defect that you identify can be fixed once and for all, as opposed to train people and realize that they do mistake, retrain them, and fine-tune your training until you have like a residual amount of mistakes that is very low, but still it's never going to be zero.
And also that leaves, or that level of training leaves once the people leave. If they move on to another job, if they retire or something.
That's why I say accretive is that, yes, the numerical recipe will keep living with the company forever, while people will effectively leave.
Well, it occurs to me that at the start of the conversation, you drew a very sharp distinction divergence between supply chain and logistics. And over the course of the conversation, we've touched on ideas of, well, automation is very clearly present in the software realm, which is the supply chain decision making, and is in the works. It's in progress in logistics.
It is very present. You see, that's the thing, is that due to the fact that I would say, as far as logistics is concerned, we are talking of the mechanization of the physical stuff. It has been a work in progress for the last 3 centuries, so people don't even realize how much we have. Nowadays, the amount of, I would say, of mechanization in those fields is just gigantic compared to what it used to be. You see, just compare the capacity of a modern truck with what people had with an early truck of a century ago, a modern truck carries way more, is much more reliable, it's much easier to operate and everything. So even if we're talking of vehicles, because a century ago, people still already had trucks, but they were not the trucks that we have today. So the progress is very significant. And I would say logistics, just like in manufacturing even more so, is heavily mechanized. But we still have people in the places where mechanization is just very, very difficult.
True. And well, then my question becomes, that then suggests that the definition started off as synonymous, diverged, but if automation is inevitable in both, will there be a convergence where it will just become one giant department, supply chain and logistics, just becomes known again as, I don't know, operations research or supply chain or logistics, but like one of those terms, and it does everything?
I mean, the question will be the disappearance of the blue-collar job. And this is just science fiction. For now, it may come at some point. And indeed, if you were to consider, a world where, let's say, Tesla has succeeded with their Android robots, and anything that a human operator can do, a machine can do, cheaper and faster, then yes, blue collars would disappear, and then the idea of having a position to manage teams of blue collar would disappear as well. You see, I believe that it's a relatively distant future. I'm not sure if I will live long enough to see it, because the challenges are just enormous. What is clear is that the domain is still progressing, progressing very nicely, but it has, we are talking of a multi-century process, you see, on this front. And there will be probably tons of things that needs to be changed in terms of infrastructure. You see, people may not even realize is that for the trucks that we have today to become so efficient, you needed, for example, to build warehouses that have, a loading dock that is like 1 meter high, and standardize that. And so it was, collectively we had to adapt the entire infrastructure to take advantage of those very, very big trucks with loading docks that are appropriate and whatnot. And that take a long time. So whatever automation will come, they will probably need to revamp entirely on things that I cannot even fathom yet, the infrastructure, and that will take time. So, but yes, at some point, if we remove entirely, the need for blue collars, the position of logistic director will disappear. And I believe that we already had in the past, entire divisions of people that have already that were already removed. Nowadays, for example, most companies used to have an entire department dedicated to sorting the mail. That is entirely gone. There will be occasionally at Lokad, we have when we receive, a letter like once a week, there will be someone from the admin team that just dropped the letter to the person, but this is it. This is gone. So I think, I can envision a future where logistics is entirely automated, and then indeed it will be a pure matter of analytics and engineering. But we are still kind of far from I would say, from this situation.
Well, by contrast, you've spoken in very strong tones, I'd say, about, and I'm quoting you here, the extinction event coming to as a result of automation in the supply chain space. So sketch out why you see it as being, more quicker in the supply chain space.
If I were to draw a picture, I see some, let's say, for example, e-commerce companies that have 500 blue collars to deal with the stuff on the ground in their warehouse and organize the shipping and the return logistics and whatnot, and 500 white collars to deal with the flow and the management
Excel
of the
sheets,
decision and
the Excel sheets,
etc. So you see, that's literally the supply chain is running with 1,000 people, half of them being blue collars. My take is that a decade from now, it is I do not see really situations where those 500 blue collars will be significantly reduced. Maybe, if they go crazy with warehouse, automated warehouse and everything, they might be able to halve this number of people. I'm talking of people who are already extensively mechanized. However, as far the decision-making processes are concerned, that is an area where the idea of going from 500 people to 5 is completely feasible. And that's Lokad is already doing that for some of its clients. We have now some clients where we have close to 1,000 employees who are consuming our decisions, but the decisions are generated for them, and Lokad is doing that with just a few supply chain scientists. So that really begs the question of, okay, we had those 1,000 white-collar employees who are generating, bulk of decisions, but those decisions have now been mechanized. So obviously, the client doesn't want to go to 0, but the idea of going from 1,000 to maybe a team of 20 is not completely unreasonable. So that's where, again, that is software in action.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Where, yes, the sort of gap, and I suspect that we will see an evolution that will be much, much more drastic for, I would say, teams of supply chain teams who are now, in many companies, as extensive as the number of people on the ground. The idea of having as many people dealing with spreadsheets as you have on the ground,
physically
stuff, dealing with the stuff, I think it was a little bit of a technological absurdity. It was just weird. I mean, we have so much super clever automation on the physical front, and for some odd reasons, we were lagging behind on the software front. And now we are just catching up with the sort of productivity that should be expected for the I would say the decision plane.
Well, in terms of bringing things to something of a close, you mentioned earlier thinking capitalistically. So what are the potential capitalistic opportunities in supply chain based on the information that you've mentioned today?
In supply chain?
Yeah.
So again, decision plane is mechanize your decisions. Why? Because until you have mechanized everything, you have the process is not accretive. So you're not in a capitalistic setting. If you invest 1 hour of 1 man hour, is it something that is consumed to generate the decision of the day? Or is it something that is invested in making all the future decisions better? You see?
Well, this is about the improvement of the numerical recipe.
Exactly. And that's why I think the practice of supply chain has been, until very recently, something that was not capitalistic. It was just OPEX, operational expenditure. You need to have this amount of this many man days every day to generate the decision that your company consumes. This is it. And you can train people, but there's limits that were reached decades ago. So those people cannot be really improved further by training, only very marginally. Because again, large companies have been training people for decades, so it's not something like novel. And so you had reached the steady state decades ago, and where automation completely changed that is that once you mechanize that, then any mandates that you invest becomes like a capitalistic investment that will pay dividends pretty much indefinitely. So that's why it is in terms of return on investment, just incomparable, because the later is literally a money printing machine.
Well, you're making an asset essentially.
Exactly. However, there are limits as well, which is at some point you do not see obvious ways to further improve your numerical recipe, and so you have diminishing returns. So you see, it's not like necessarily an asset that can have unlimited returns, because at some point you may stall in your capacity to make the recipe better.
But the upper bound is still significantly higher than people believe it is today.
And for companies that have not mechanized yet the decision, the gap is just absolutely enormous.
So money. Think in terms of money.
Yes.
Boom. Well, Joannes, I don't have any further questions. I've picked your brain quite a bit today. I've missed these conversations, actually. But again, thank you very much for your time. And thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.